Clients with self-employment income. The community tax centers often assist clients who are self-employed with their tax preparation. Clients who are self-employed do not receive a W-2 reporting their income, but rather may receive payment for work in the following forms: cash payments, payment by a personal check, or a payroll check from a company that will not be removing any taxes from the client's paycheck. A Form 1099 miscellaneous may be issued to a self-employed client, whereas other clients will file their income taxes using the total of all of their cash or check payments received during the year. Examples of self-employed individuals are gardeners or landscapers, freelance workers such as graphic designers, actors and journalists, cab drivers, and clients who drive rideshare companies such as Uber and Lyft, beauticians, painters, and carpenters. A general rule of thumb when determining if a client is self-employed is if the income is earned and is not reported on a W-2, then the client is probably self-employed. Self-employed clients are often required to purchase items in order to complete their work. These items purchased can be a business expense. Self-employed clients are able to use business expenses as a deduction on their tax return. They should bring a list of these expenses with them to the tax site. Use the Self-Employment Expense Worksheet to help guide you and the taxpayer in categorizing all qualified expenses. Keep in mind that we can only deduct expenses bought specifically for the work that is considered to be self-employment. Here are examples of possible business expenses. A landscaper may have to purchase a rake or shovel in order to complete the job. The rake or shovel would be a business expense since the work could not be completed without these items. A housekeeper may purchase cleaning supplies, such as a mop or liquid cleaners like bleach. These purchases are required to complete the job and can be deducted. So keeping in mind that we can only deduct expenses that are specifically related to the self-employment work. Let's go through a few more examples. If a client works as a chef and will receive a W-2, but is also a freelance beautician, the beautician work is self-employment. Expenses related to the beautician work is deductible, whereas expenses to the chef work cannot be deductible. Here is a list of examples. Determine if the client is allowed to claim the expenses on their tax return or not. Business cards that promotes the beautician business, hair color, a butcher knife, smocks, and a chef uniform. The business cards, hair color, and smocks are allowed expenses for the beautician work. The butcher knife and chef uniform are expenses related to the client's W-2 employment, so cannot be deducted. When completing the intake interview for a self-employed client, give the client a business expense worksheet to begin completing while you are reviewing and photocopying the IDs and Social Security cards or I-10 letters. Instruct the client to complete the expense form for each job that was self-employed. Similar jobs can be grouped together, such as if a client works for 2 rideshare companies or was a painter for 2 different companies. The income and expenses of similar jobs can be entered on the same expense worksheet, but only work expenses can be entered on the worksheet and never living expenses, such as diapers for a dependent or any utility bills. The income and expense worksheet does take a bit of time to complete, so many clients will continue to work on their expenses once the intake interview has been completed. Your job as the intake coordinator is to help the client begin the process of documenting the business expenses, but the client should return to the waiting area to do the final completion of the business expense worksheet while waiting for the tax preparer. Let's take a moment to talk about mileage. There are 2 methods that the IRS allows to account for miles driven in the year. The first method is the actual expense method, which is to note specific expense amounts for what it costs to operate the car for business use that year. This method includes amounts spent on gas, car maintenance, repairs, tires, insurance, registration fees, all attributable to the total miles driven that are business miles. Foundation communities will not prepare a tax return using this method. taxpayers have the option to use a paid tax preparer if they prefer to use the actual expense method on their tax return. The second method is the standard mileage rate, in which you notate the total number of miles driven for business use. The IRS each year identifies a reimbursement rate. When multiplied by the total miles driven, provides a final dollar amount to use as a deduction on your Schedule C. In our VITA program, we are only allowed to use the standard mileage rate. Parking fees and tolls related to business use of the vehicle can be claimed as an expense on the return regardless of the mileage reimbursement method used. To calculate total miles, we first ask the taxpayer if they drove to the same location every day or did they have multiple locations in the day. We only count miles driven between the first business location and the last site before the taxpayer returns home. An exception to this is for taxpayers who have a home office, but those taxpayers are out of scope for the VITA program. Here are some self-employment topics that make a tax return out of scope for VITA. If the taxpayer has business expenses greater than $25,000, if the taxpayer pays employees or workers, if the taxpayer is claiming a home office deduction, if after calculating total income and total expenses, the taxpayer has a business loss, if the taxpayer had more than 3 separate businesses during the year. If you notice that any of the items mentioned applies to your taxpayer, such as a taxpayer mentioning that he has employees, please refer the client to the out-of-scope program. This is a special group of volunteers within Foundation Communities that can prepare certain tax returns considered to be out of scope for the VITA program. To see the complete list of topics the out-of-scope team can prepare, take a look at the back page of the handout titled "Your Return is Out of Scope," which is available on CTC Resources and will be printed out and located at each site. Clients must be referred to the out-of-scope program via an online referral form completed by a staff member at the site. If your client is out of scope for VITA and the item that makes the tax return out of scope appears on this handout, please find a staff member. They will help refer the client to the out-of-scope program. After completing the referral form, the client will leave the site with all of their original paperwork and is contacted within 1 week to be scheduled for an appointment at either our north or south location. Things to remember: an individual can have a W-2 wage income and self-employment income. Taxpayers need to report all earned income on their tax return. This includes very part-time work, jobs that only lasted a couple of days, and income that was earned in cash. Some people receive a 1099 miscellaneous instead of a W-2 as self-employment income, but many do not. If a taxpayer did not receive a 1099 miscellaneous, they can report the total of cash or check payments that they received in the tax year. A client must complete a tax return to include all self-employment income in any dollar amount, even if the amount is below the IRS filing requirement.